Well, let's talk about Joe Biden's final few weeks in office in the company of Emily Jashinsky, who is Unheard's Washington, D.C. correspondent. Great to have you with us, Emily. Is there much that President Joe Biden can do between now and January?
Well, I think particularly looking at the war in Ukraine, there's absolutely plenty that Joe Biden can do between now and January. I mean, just over the course of the last week, he obviously used his presidential authority to authorize the ATACMS use inside of Russia, which is massively significant in terms of the course of that war. So it totally changed the landscape that Donald Trump is stepping into in terms of those negotiations. Now, obviously, he doesn't have Congress. There are plans, for example, that Biden is trying to implement just administratively to safe-proof or Trump-proof some of the big changes that Donald Trump wants to make to the agencies. They can't really prevent them, but they can sort of bureaucratically add hoops that Donald Trump has to jump through in order to enact some sweeping reforms to the administrative agencies, the bureaucracy. But without Congress, no, I mean, there's just not a ton Biden can do in terms of like big agenda items legislatively.
No, so domestically, essentially, that's run its course. But your argument is, and your point is that as the commander in chief of the armed forces, until Trump enters the White House, then Biden can do more on the international stage and in terms of military action.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the dramatic step he took last week was very clear, made that very clear. We don't know where this goes in the weeks ahead, but we know Joe Biden is in charge until Donald Trump literally takes the oath of office. And that can mean all kinds of things. That can mean different things for his negotiations. I mean, negotiations are ongoing right now with Hamas and with Israel. And the Biden administration, Tony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, is very much a part of those ongoing negotiations. So it's not just Ukraine. And even domestically, Joe Biden was able to change his own immigration policy via executive actions and bureaucratic tweaking. So it's not that there's nothing he can do. I mean, there's a lot he can do domestically. It's just that he's more limited because he doesn't have Congress. And when you have a lame duck presidency, you're sort of more limited to the cash that you bring into any congressional negotiations as well. So he's confirming a lot of judicial nominees. That's something that the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, were a little bit disturbed by, but that's something that's ongoing as well. So there are some spheres, but he is limited without Congress and with that kind of lame duck stench on him now.
Indeed. I mean, does Joe Biden still have time to establish a legacy when it comes to conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza?
Absolutely. But what that legacy will be is probably not. Does he have time to establish the type of legacy that he wants? No, because we've seen that Joe Biden sees these conflicts as really central to what he wanted to be a historic presidency. There were reports early in his time in office about how he was meeting with the presidential historian John Meacham and trying intentionally to cast himself in the story of history as an FDR-like figure. That is how Joe Biden saw his presidency, and it's how he wanted history to remember his presidency, that he was this heroic, embracer of the American story who was going to seal some of these or was going to be a leader on the world stage after he saw Donald Trump, put America in the back seat on the world stage, as he would have argued. And that would mean him leaving his presidency without two hot wars that started under his presidency ongoing. And there's no way that he has time to actually wind down either of those conflicts significantly between the holidays and when Donald Trump takes his oath of office. He could try, but his legacy won't be remembered the way that he wants it to, no matter what.
Is the Biden administration seeking to do anything right now which could tie the hands of the future president?
They definitely are trying to. So the ATACMS is a good example. Donald Trump can't, undo that happening. He could, say we're not cooperating with the ATACMS anymore, but it's already happened. The can of worms proverbially has been opened. So he sort of tied Trump's hands going into that. Right away. There are obviously positions, there are deals that he could strike in the Middle East that would tie Donald Trump's hands. And Donald Trump is sort of an unusual politician, an unconventional politician who doesn't necessarily feel as though his hands are tied in ways other politicians would.
Mm.
So maybe that doesn't mean quite as much. But domestically, obviously, they're also adding the hoops bureaucratically that the Trump administration will have to jump through in order to make some of those sweeping changes to departments like the Department of Education or the Environmental Protection Agency. There's some stuff that they can do that'll make it harder for Trump. Not a ton, though.
Are the Biden administration concerned about a US sellout of Ukraine?
I think they're terrified, genuinely terrified of what could come from the Trump administration because Donald Trump himself has been rather cagey about what his plans actually are. He says he wants to make a deal. And I actually think that's sort of a stroke of political genius. He's probably the only person who can get away with saying that his plans for Ukraine concretely are just to make a deal. Without saying exactly what that would look like. Should Biden be terrified about what happens in Ukraine? Probably not, because we've seen hints from, fairly hawkish people in Russia like Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz, who are in the cabinet. Sebastian Gorka was just named as a top national security advisor to the White House. Very, very hawkish on Ukraine. So there may not be a significant change in policy, at least under Donald Trump. These are still fairly hawkish conservative Republicans who want to see Putin defeated as much as is possible to wind the war down. But there's definitely way more of an appetite among the Republican base right now to wind that war down than there was among Biden's voters. So that does give Republicans a little extra push to come to a conclusion more quickly than perhaps Biden would like.
Well, have some on the right been listening to too much Tucker Carlson? Are we overstating the extent to which Trump will simply end the war in Ukraine? Is it conceivable that this awful war could continue well into the president-elect's administration and his term of office?
That's absolutely conceivable because he surrounded himself with, I think, some fairly hawkish voices on Ukraine. It's not as though Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to be his Secretary of State. Now, Tulsi Gabbard is going to be the Director of National Intelligence if she is confirmed, which is a powerful position, but it's not Secretary of State. It's not the head of the Pentagon. Pete Hegseth has been very serious about the war in Ukraine and about defeating Putin. So again, I think that Republicans are sensitive to the idea that if you don't do something about the American border and you are perceived as not addressing domestic issues while also continuing to fund the war in Ukraine at a significant level, those two things are not compatible for Republicans. But I think in their minds, if they are perceived as tackling immigration and domestic problems, fentanyl, et cetera, then they have a little bit more leeway to continue aiding Ukraine at a similar level.
That's really interesting. So do you anticipate, I mean, it's a hard question to answer because no one can read into the mind of Donald Trump, can they, Emily? But do you anticipate, therefore, probably continuity when it comes to US foreign policy in relation to Ukraine?
It all rests on Donald Trump. I think that's a really trenchant observation. It's if it were just Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz and some of those guys, then I think there would be more continuity than people expect, given how much the Republican base has expressed discomfort with the ongoing policies in Ukraine. But Donald Trump could, of course, in his conversations with Zelensky, whom he seems to like, he seems to have a pretty good relationship with Zelensky for whatever he said about Vladimir Putin, he could come in and say, Putin's just not coming to the table. I'm not going to negotiate either. I don't think Putin is negotiating in good faith. This is all conceivable. I think it's more likely that he is able to get both parties to the table and feel as though they're operating in good faith in a way Joe Biden could not. I think that probably is the more likely outcome, but it's not inconceivable that surrounded by hawks and with a decent relationship with Zelensky himself, he's continues a similar policy to the Biden administration with an increased focus on domestic issues that feels like it's more fair and more just to a lot of Americans.
And do you have a sense of how the handover of power is going? Does it seem harmonious and constructive?
It does seem fairly harmonious, actually, to an extent that surprised some people here in Washington, the degree to which establishment Democrats have been willing to say, listen, we want, Donald Trump to be successful, and we're going to help that friendly relationship or the friendly meeting that Biden and Trump had with the big fire roaring behind them in the White House a couple of weeks was sort of surprising to a lot of people here in Washington. At the same time, the Trump administration has not taken the formal steps for the transition that other presidential campaigns typically do, or winning campaigns typically do. There are actual formal legal steps that you can take to start to work with the outgoing administration, meaning you get classified information, you get security information that you don't get from the outside, and that's not happening. The Trump campaign is not, or the incoming Trump administration is not cooperating so far. That could change, but it seems as though at least Democrats are sort of chastened and are more willing to work with the incoming Trump administration than the incoming Trump administration is willing to work with them.
And so therefore, no obvious or overt animosity between the president and the president-elect. However, that probably isn't the case for the president and his own party and the woman who usurped him in the race for the White House.
It doesn't seem to be. It seems as though they're as frosty as that relationship has ever been. And we know that it's never been a particularly good relationship, given that Kamala Harris made a conscious decision to attack Joe Biden's record on race. And that was reportedly very upsetting to Jill Biden, very upsetting to Joe Biden, and they never quite recovered from it. And so from all indications, reporting, and even just watching the videos, for example, of Kamala Harris not interacting with Jill Biden when they were at an event together recently, that is going to be painful, especially as Kamala Harris is reportedly looking to run for governor of California and to have an ongoing voice in the party that is at a high level. I wouldn't expect that tension to go anywhere.
There's talk of Kamala Harris being the front runner to have the nomination for the Democrats for the race for the White House in 2028. To paraphrase John McEnroe, you must be kidding.
Yeah, well, that's with name ID, which starts showing up in polling is, I would say, these false numbers, these falsely hopeful numbers, or they can give people false hope, because when you just got off the ticket and you have high name ID, you're going to start looking good in the polling after your loss, because there aren't really obvious Democrats waiting in the wings. So it's just something that, like when Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, she was also polling surprisingly high, and that wears off over time. So if they're taking cues from these polls, they should look back at their history, because they probably aren't durable after she leaves the administration. So I mean, I'm sure she is serious about it. She has a lot of big money behind her in California. And I'm sure she's insulated from some of the criticism of her campaign. We continue to hear that it was, quote, flawless from some people in the American media. So I wouldn't count her out at all.
No. Although I guess California would be the consolation prize. She definitely wants to save face, I would have thought, at this point.
You would think, but she probably is insulated from some of those criticisms that even are telling her she would need to save face, because if there are a lot of people in the press who still say that campaign was really good, that it was really well done, and I'm sure some of her aides are telling her the same thing, that it was just the bigotry of the American people, it was just misinformation and disinformation that led so many Americans to choose Trump over her.
Although the notion of a noble defeat isn't really in the American psyche, is it? So, it's curious. It'll be interesting to see how history treats Kamala Harris. How will history treat Joe Biden, do you think, Emily? It's a big question, but overall, has he been a good president?
Joe Biden, I think, will be properly understood years from now as a Greek tragedy. He's a very tragic figure. This is somebody who's had personal tragedies dotting the course of his life that have informed then professional tragedies. So after losing his wife and his daughter, he goes into the Senate and has this career at very high levels in the Senate, runs for president, fails out, has to leave the race because of plagiarism accusations, plays second fiddle to Barack Obama, doesn't run when Hillary Clinton loses, and plots this sort of Rooseveltian presidency after winning during COVID, and ends up having to drop out in the least possible dignified way. I mean, it was so undignified, his exit from the race, that he was actually humiliated during a debate. And his party is humiliated because Kamala Harris, the woman he chose as vice president, is such a disaster. I think he'll be looked at as somebody. He has 2 wars start under the course of his presidency. He was never able to get inflation back below COVID levels. In fact, probably contributed to that via his legislation. So while he may have some success long term, looking at infrastructure, chips investment, and all of that, it will be massively overshadowed by the war and the economic pain that so many Americans felt during his presidency.
Indeed. I mean, are there any redeeming features to his presidency? Is there any aspect to which the guy is underrated? What about the robust economic growth that America has enjoyed in recent times?
Well, it's definitely, most Americans aren't feeling happy economically because inflation, while it's come down, and growth is up. Not everyone's wage growth is matching that, and it's also still not down to pre-COVID levels, which is people remember that. You were looking at the cost of Thanksgiving, and some of the media outlets right now are saying it's going down, it's going down. This is great news. Well, it's actually still not down below where it was in 2019 by their own measurements, and people remember that. So, while it maybe feels a little bit better, it doesn't feel like some of these big problems have been solved. Now, it may be good in the long term for the Biden administration when we look at how those infrastructure bills and the CHIPS investment affects, policy towards China and affects American infrastructure. That may turn out, within a decade's time, for example, to have been a successful industrial policy, essentially, that is regarded well on a bipartisan level. But certainly on immigration and foreign policy, the economy immediately, time is not going to heal those wounds for people.
No, and that's before you get to the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is a distant memory, but of course a devastating moment in recent political history in terms of America. Well, fascinating. Before we let you go, Emily, are there any further rabbits in the hat that we might enjoy from Joe Biden? Does he have one last hurrah in him? Is there anything that could happen between now and January which will raise an eyebrow or surprise us in any way?
He could pardon his son, Hunter Biden. That could be a significant outgoing presidential decision. There are all kinds of random executive actions that can be taken and then be undone quickly when Donald Trump steps in. The pardon is the one thing that I would look out for most closely. It's always an interesting decision that outgoing presidents make. And of course, in this case, it actually involves Joe Biden's son. So that would be something to look out for.
Okay, and last but not least, when I said last question, it was my penultimate, it turns out. But Emily, I've got to ask you this. Just the mood music of the Trump camp, does this feel like a more mature group who are returning to the White House for a second time? Will Trump be a wiser, more temperate president? And does the makeup of his team suggest that this will be an altogether more grown-up and professional outfit?
It is definitely a more grown-up and professional outfit. Whether that translates into Donald Trump's temperament as president, I think is an open question, because Donald Trump is going to be Donald Trump no matter who he surrounds himself with, and that's what makes predictions so difficult. But there was an off-season attempt to professionalize the Trump agenda, and that was very real. Project 2025 was very real, and many people who were involved in Project 2025, they would have gone into a Ron DeSantis presidency too. But now they're going to be in the Trump administration, people like Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, who are very serious policy wonks and have spent years now planning for exactly what they would do starting on day one of the next Republican administration. And they're ready to implement those plans. There's no question about that.
Emily, an absolute thrill and an education to have you on the show. Emily Jashinsky is Unheard's Washington, D.C. correspondent. Thanks, Emily. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you.